So this week I did get a question regarding content about making more precise the difference between reduction and eliminativism. And reductionism and eliminativism aren't distinct, but they are different. And so I'll say something about this, but much of what I'm going to say today with regards to Churchland has to do with reductionism. Physicalism needs to say that either we eliminate everything not physical or anything not physical is reducible to the physical. And eliminativism is an ontological move to take something out of our ontology, our list of the things that exist. We can do this with substances or with properties, right? If we eliminate the mental as a substance, we go from something like Cartesian dualism to monism and say all there are physical substances. We can also do this with properties and say, well, the mental properties, we're going to eliminate them, and by doing so, we're saying that there's nothing to a mental property other than a physical property. It is just a physical property. We could allow still that we retain in our language talk of mental properties, because that's a different way of describing a physical property, a different way of picking out structure of the world. So we have grouping physical properties. And so we might retain the way of talking, but in talking, when I say something about a mental property, if I've eliminated mental properties from the ontology, then when I'm saying something about a mental property, I'm saying something about a physical property or some collection of physical properties. Reductionism has to do with methodology more than eliminativism does. And so we reduce a higher level theory or higher level properties to a lower level theory or lower level properties if we can capture that higher level science or the higher level properties in terms of the lower level science or the lower level properties. And what we mean by capture there needs to be cashed out, and there's different accounts of what that would mean, and we'll see some of that in Churchland. But we could be motivated to eliminate something from the ontology without any consideration of reductionism. If we do reduce a higher level science to a lower level science, then there's the question of what this says as far as eliminativism goes. If we can reduce everything in the higher science to a lower level science, then what does it mean to say that there is something ontologically described by the higher level science? If there's something in the higher level science that can't be captured by the lower level science, and therefore we can't reduce the higher level science entirely to the lower level science, then we don't want to eliminate it. We don't want to eliminate it because there is something described by that higher level science, not described by the lower level science. If we can describe everything by the higher level science, then how is reduction just not eliminativism? Depending on our stance we take on various things, maybe it is. Then we're motivated to make an eliminativist move on reductionist considerations. Okay. So some of that will be made more precise when we get to Churchland. And so I'm going to focus on the Churchland. I'm going to talk about the Nagel and the Jackson. I'm going to focus on the Churchland. If you're writing on Qualia, then you need to look at the Nagel and the Jackson in detail to make sure you understand their arguments so as to understand Churchland's response to their arguments. Start with Nagel and what it's like to be a bat. And so he's concerned with the qualitative experience of a bat. Qualia. Qualia are the properties of an experience that have phenomenological properties, qualitative properties, right? So I look at a tree, I receive all kinds of information. Information about its height, how green it is. I could get lots of that information through like reading a description of the tree. A description of the height of the tree will tell me how high the tree is. But the qualitative experience I have, what it's like for me to see the greenness of the tree, is its qualia, the qualia of that experience. And then the question is whether or not we can deal with qualia and reduce qualia. Whether we could explain qualia in terms of a lower level science or in terms of lower level properties, physical, neurophysiological properties. To have qualitative experience, consciousness involves qualitative experience, also involves functional experience. And to have qualitative experience is what it is like to be a thing. That's what Nagel says. And he says, well, the qualia cannot be captured fully by way of functionalism, experience has functional properties, but it also has qualitative properties. And the real problem with reducing the mind, reducing consciousness, is that we have to capture those qualitative features. We've already seen attempts to capture the functional, the input-output, the behavioral properties of mental content. But if we're going to reduce the mental to the physical, if we're going to reduce psychology to physics and chemistry, to neurophysiology, well, we need to account for all of what psychology contains, all of what psychological experience, mental experience contains, and one of those things is qualitative experience, what it's like to have an experience. Two reds are not the same. One is brighter than the other. There's something different about the way it is to look at one of the red things than there is to look at the other red thing. Can we capture that physically? And so one thing we get here this week in these readings is a much more fair and in touch with science sort of treatment of these issues. We'll see that the fact that the conclusions drawn by Nagel and Jackson are much more conservative than the conclusions drawn by Foster and by Chalmers. And so one thing Nagel says is that qualia are subjective. I have qualitative experiences, you have qualitative experiences. We might look at the exact same red thing, and maybe it's slightly different in my experience. The way I experience it seems to me slightly different than the way you experience it. Qualia are subjective. But physics is an objective theory. And it seems like we could not capture subjective things by a general theory that's objective. Foster was dealing with this when he went to idiosyncratic laws that refer to me. When I look at red, I have such and such experience. When you look at red, you have such and such an experience. But that's not the nature. The objection there was that, well, we got lots of problems from this. That is, that's not the way science goes. We don't have a science of my mental experience and a science of your mental experience. Now we have a science, and that applies generally. It's the nature of science. We don't want to predict, control, and explain in some super narrow domain. We want to predict, control, and explain in all relevant domains, right? So if it is the case that we can't capture the subjective objectively, then we could not capture it by an objective science, physics. This will get dealt with when we get to Churchland to some extent, but I want to say up front that there's an issue here, that there's a difference between a difference and a distinctness. And if your qualitative experience is different from my qualitative experience, and therefore subjective because it's different, that's one thing. If nothing in your qualitative experience is anything like in my qualitative experience, that's something else. In the first case where they're different, we might share lots of properties of our qualitative experience. Yours might vary from mine slightly. In that case, there might be building blocks that underwrite my qualitative experience and your qualitative experience, and you make use of some different building blocks than I do. Slightly different neuronal state in you than in me, but not entirely different neural state. If that's the case, that's fine. We could capture that by an objective science and say that the subjective experience is just an appeal to a different group of those objective properties that underwrite qualitative experience. If yours is purely distinct from mine, we share nothing in common, then there's a big concern. Unless, of course, there could still be building blocks if you and I have distinct qualitative experience. If everyone has distinct qualitative experience, then we have a problem. We have not established that. I don't think that we can establish that, at least not at this point. Right? And so one way Nagel is more scientific, more charitable than Foster and Chalmers, he goes through his argument and then he concludes, well, this is a big problem. It's a big problem for physical science. We do not know how we could possibly capture qualia by physicalism. But we should not conclude from that that physicalism is false. Rather, we should conclude from that that if physicalism can capture mental experience, then we need to do lots of work on physicalism. And then he makes a positive suggestion there. He says, well, one thing we would need to do is develop a phenomenology Phenomenology would be the study, the scientific study of phenomena, phenomenal experience. Just like biology groups things, builds laws on those things, physics does the same thing. It divides the world up in relevant ways to make predictions, controls, and explanation. If we could have a phenomenology, a science of what it's like to have phenomenal experience, if we could introspect and find building blocks of experience, one experience of red and another experience of red, they're different, something's different about them, but they share some things in common. If I could divide phenomenal experience into smaller and smaller parts and build a science of phenomenology there, then maybe we could move in the direction of a physicalism that captured mental content, mental experience, psychology. And he says this might lead to all kinds of new insights, positive scientific suggestion in response to the fact that we can't currently reduce psychology to physics, to neurophysics, and so on. And I want to take a second to take an aside here. So materialism is the doctrine that everything that exists is material. This was at one time in history the main foil to dualism, or to idealism. But then we came to believe, by way of physics, that there are non-material physical things. Physics studies things that are not material. They do not have mass. And so the word materialism got replaced with the word physicalism. Partially, processes are not massive, but they're studied by physics. We might actually think there are non-massive building blocks to matter. That's an issue for physicists to account for. Nonetheless, the move from materialism to physicalism was based on expanding the ontology to say, well, the ontology is not exhausted by massive things, but rather physical things. And it's not vacuous to say that physical things are those things studied by physics, and physics studies physical things, because the thing studied by physics is just a catch-all for the actual list of things studied by physics. And so we can expand that circle. And if physics comes to tell us something new, then maybe we just take that as part of our ontology, or maybe we debate that. Naturalism is a doctrine that goes in the same direction, from materialism to physicalism, from physicalism to naturalism, and say that, well, our ontology is exhausted by the natural, which includes non-physical things. Maybe here we have processes of some sort that are not physical. So that's a note on naturalism, as naturalism's coming up. Okay, I'm going to leave Nagel now and go to Jackson. I'm not going to go through Jackson in too much detail, but rather think of the Fred case. The Fred case, Fred can discern red in a way that everyone else cannot. Fred sees two different colors of red. To Fred, red 1 and red 2 are as distinct as blue and yellow are to me and you. And then there's the issue of, well, could we ever capture what Fred experiences physically? If we could, then we know the physical facts, and we should be able to experience what Fred experiences, or know what Fred experiences. One issue here, at one point he talks about Fred could have different hardware, different cones, etc. If this is the issue, then there's a real problem here, because if Fred has different hardware, just like a bat has different hardware than I do, no knowledge about that hardware and how it works is going to help me have the knowledge of what it is like to experience red for Fred. It's not going to help me have any knowledge of what it's like to experience the world like a bat, because I don't have the hardware to run that software. And then Mary, the Mary case. One thing that comes out here is very important, how you word things in your argument. So how I'm going to state it is that Mary in the room has all of the physical information. Mary gets out of the room and learns something about the physical world. If that's true, Mary did not have all of the information. But here, whether we say information or knowledge that, all of these things matter. Right? Mary in the room, neuroscientist, can only be experiencing black and white things because of the setup of the system. Mary exhausts all neurological information. She learns it all. She gets out of the room. She experiences something. She has new knowledge what it is like to see red. Before she had all the physical knowledge, now she's learned something, namely what it's like to see red. If she learned something, but she had all the physical knowledge, then there's something to be known that's not captured by the physical knowledge. If this is the case, physicalism cannot express this, so says Jackson. Then Jackson, he's looking for what is the most useful argument against physicalism. And useful here means something like motivating and convincing. He thinks the knowledge argument, as captured by the Fred case and the Mary case, is the best argument to be motivating and convincing. He considers the modal argument, which is Chalmers' argument, and he notes that this is not going to be a convincing argument because it turns on a debatable intuition. Some people will buy Chalmers' intuition, other people will not buy Chalmers' intuition. I've already dealt with all of that. He says that the modal argument's not going to work. He doesn't treat any problems with the modal argument. He rather says, even if there were no problems with the modal argument formally, as an argument, it turns on a premise that not everyone's going to buy, so it's not going to convince everyone. He thinks the knowledge argument's better on those grounds. And then a few more interesting points in Jackson. One, he wants to respond to various arguments against epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism holds that mental experience is non-causal, does not cause other mental experiences, does not cause other physical experiences, right? I put this chart on the board before. May appear that it does, but all the causation's occurring at the physical level. An additional claim that some tack on, not everyone tacks on. There's a division in epiphenomenalism whether the mental can cause mental. Seems to be a problem if it does, because then we have overdetermination. But anyways, he's going to respond to various objections to epiphenomenalism. One objection is that it seems like mental experiences are causal. You say that I punched you and the pain made you pull away. And he says, well, but this is a seeming, not an actuality. It was not the pain doing the causation there. It was the physical doing the causation there. The mental experience and the later physical experience, you saying, ow, that hurts, and you pulling away, those were co-caused. They were caused by the first physical experience of C fibers firing or something of that sort. And so he gives the example of the Western. The Western, you have someone throws a punch, and then the head moves to the side, and you say, well, that image of the punch caused the image of the head moving to the side. No, in actual, they were co-caused by the presentation of the film. Maybe not the best example, but we can understand co-causation. So the fact that they seem causally related, that is, that mental properties seem to have causal power, does not mean they have causal power. One way in which they may not is if the mental and the later effect that is physical, or a later mental effect, have one cause. They're co-caused. Another response to epiphenomenalism is, well, look, on Darwinian grounds, we would not have mental experiences if mental experiences did not play some survival role. If they play some survival role, they must have causal power. They must be able to make a difference in us. And his response to this is like, well, no. What we know from Darwinian grounds is that everything is either a product of, it's in place because it has survival value, or it's a byproduct of something that was selected for because of survival value. So it could be the case that, say, we had a need to survive to be complicated enough in our processing, our functional processing, to deal with lots of different situations. Animals are well suited to a small range of environments. Humans can survive in many different kinds of environments. They have the ability to be highly plastic. Maybe in developing the hardware necessary to give us that plasticity, we became so complicated in our hardware that sort of emergently arose qualitative experiences as a byproduct of the complexity. And so they're not causal. The hardware processes are the causal. Rather, qualitative experience is just a free-riding shadow that is non-causal, a byproduct of the selection of the hardware. And then finally, the third objection to epiphenomenalism he responds to is, well, we have knowledge of other people's minds. I know that you have a mind, and I make prediction controlled explanations on your mental operations based on other mental events. Right? You say that you're in pain, you say that you don't like something, you say you don't like oranges, so I can predict if you eat an orange, you're going to have an unpleasant experience. I have knowledge of what it's like to be you to some extent. That is, if you were to eat an orange, you would have an unpleasant experience. I base that on evidence I have for something mental about you that you do not like oranges. He says, well, but this is not going from a mental thing to a mental thing. Rather, I know because of the mental thing that you're saying, there is a physical cause of your not liking oranges, and that physical cause would produce the later effect of you having an unpleasant experience if you ate an orange. Co-causation again. I'm going from an inference from one effect, mental effect of something physical, and by way of that something physical, predicting the later mental effect. Even if I can't close that reasoning process, what's going on there is the co-causation of the physical. And then finally, Jackson says, well, look, we shouldn't be all that concerned that physicalism looks not to be true, that there are epiphenomenal mental properties, because physicalism is just overly optimistic. What are the chances, and this is how he states it, that everything in the world, so physicalism says we can, well, he's putting a lot into physicalism here. He's saying that physicalism says that we can capture all of the world by physics. I'm not sure if it needs to say that. What it needs to say is that all of the world could be captured by physics, whether we can or not. But then he says, well, but what are the chances that the world takes such a form that all of it could be described by us, given that we're a product of evolution and the things we've learned to deal with are the things relevant to us? Here's the sluggist case, right? These slug philosophers at the bottom of the sea. I think that's great. But he says it's just highly unlikely that we've evolved in such a way that all of the world is relevant to our survival. We've come to be able to learn about the things that are relevant to our survival. If physicalism can allow us to learn everything, then it must be able to capture everything. If it can capture everything and we can learn about it, then everything is relevant to our survival. And then he puts in place somewhat of a more pessimistic view. We can't learn everything. There are some things that are just outside of our ability to know. So two things here. One, the response to the claim that we can only know things that are relevant to our survival. It seems to be inconsistent with his very claim about byproducts. If my mental experience is a byproduct of physical selection, and I can know about my mental experience, then I can know about byproducts and not just the things that were selected for survival. It's an additional issue to establish that mental experience is a non-physical thing. So I don't think it needs to be the case that only the things that we can know about are the things that we were selected for because they had survival value for us. We can learn about things that had no survival value for us. I think that we learn that all the time. I mean, specific things like, the dietary impact of cheesecake. That's a higher level property. Maybe we could reduce it to, well, the dietary impact of carbohydrates and sugar and fat. Okay, that's fine. But cheesecake itself, that higher level property of being a cheesecake, had nothing to do with our survival value. We can know about it. That's not a byproduct. But if mental experiences are a byproduct, I can know about just my own ruminations, my own considerations, my own imagination that's not connected to the world in any direct way, immediate way. It seems that there's an issue there. Another claim, the claim that physicalism is over-optimistic and that we might want to be more pessimistic. This is going to be dealt with when we get to Flanagan. And I said a little bit in response to Chalmers, but there's good scientific reason for us to be optimistic. If we try really hard and there's something that we just can't figure out and we keep trying and trying and trying and we can't figure it out, that's one thing. If we start off by saying we'll never understand it, that's something else, because then we cannot even go about investigating. We've just thrown our hands up. And we've guaranteed a lack of knowledge where there could have potentially been knowledge. We'll come back to that in the next video. So moving on to Churchland. Here's where we get lots of talk about reductionism. Okay? And Churchland starts, he wants to talk about the older view of what reductionism is. Here we have the old theory, the higher level theory that we want to reduce. Right? And the old theory said that, well, the old theory reduces to the new theory by way of bridge laws or corresponding principles. Right? The old theory reduces to by way of bridge laws. Before I put this here on our line, here we're putting it in the whole reduction. It does not make a big difference. We need the bridge laws to get to the new theory. The old theory reducible to, by way of bridge laws, a new theory. Biology reducible to physics by way of bridge laws that say, here's a list of biological terms, and each of those biological terms hooks up to this physical term. These biological laws hook up with this physical law. Psychological terms, psychological laws to these physical terms, physical laws. And I put it this way because this is not the order that Churchland puts it in the book, right? Churchland has this up here and the old theory down here because he wants to say that the new theory and the bridge laws entail the old theory. If I know all of this, then I can figure out all of this. Put it this way because it's the way I have been putting it throughout the higher level theory up top. He says correspondence rules here, correspondence rules, bridge laws, not a big difference there. That's what we need. So that's the old view of what it would be to reduce something. So we need a rigorous conception of what reduction is, what it is for a new theory to capture an old theory in order to evaluate whether or not we can reduce a theory to another theory. Right? And so here's the old theory. The old theory of reductionism, the old view of reductionism. We have the old theory. By way of bridge laws, we reduce it to the new theory. We could put, and so this has to do with actual progress in science, right? We move from an older theory within even physics to a newer theory within physics, but also we can deal with reducing biology to physics, right? We have biological terms, they pick out things. We could give, say, a 6 n-dimensional phase-space description of all of those biological entities and group them. It'd be very difficult. How do we know that, say, 2 dogs, things I can recognize at the biological level very easily, how do I recognize that there are 2 different 6 n-dimensional space descriptions of the 2 dogs should be grouped together into a kind? It's going to be complicated, but if there are rules at the higher level, by way of bridge laws, we can figure out what those rules would be at the lower level. So it also has to do with, again, progress within a given science. Can an older version of physics, say Newtonian mechanics, be captured or reduced to quantum mechanics? And so reduction doesn't have to be from a higher level science to a lower level science, but we can do an older theory to a newer theory, and that's the way Churchland's expressing it here. And the reason is because expressing it this way can bring out certain problems with this old view of reduction, and from that we can get a newer, more refined view of reduction. He says, well, but here's a problem with the old view of reduction. Oftentimes, what's in the old theory is false. But, a little bit of deductive logic, if the new theory entails the old theory, then we say, well, if something's true in the new theory, then that thing is true and stated here in the old theory. But if it's as a matter of fact that the old theory is false, so if the new theory, then that entails the old theory. But if the old theory is false, that means the new theory is false because it contains the old theory under a different description. This is a problem. This is not the way we want things to go. We don't want to say that if we can capture, if we can reduce Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics, and Newtonian mechanics is false, then quantum mechanics is false. That was not what we wanted to do at all. If we have a higher level science like psychology that we end up finding the way it describes the world is not accurate, but we can reduce it to physics. Physics entails psychology, but psychology is false, so physics is false. That's not what we wanted at all. And he says, well, what we need to do here is say that really we need to add in more things. We need to add in limiting conditions, or limiting assumptions. Okay. Limiting assumptions and boundary conditions. This would say something like, well, the new theory only captures the old theory under certain conditions, and only some range of the new theory corresponds to the old theory. Something like that. So we add these in and we say, well, the things that were false in Newtonian mechanics, I'm saying that only under certain conditions would quantum mechanics, say, make the same predictions as Newtonian mechanics when we're dealing with low speeds and medium-sized objects. Or to make an example with Euclidean geometry, right? So at one point we had Euclidean geometry, we still have Euclidean geometry, but it was thought that Euclidean geometry was accurate, an accurate description of our world. We have the axioms of Euclidean geometry. If they're true, then the internal angles of a triangle sum to 180 degrees. A triangle here, angle A, angle B, angle C, A plus B plus C equals 180 degrees. This follows for Euclidean geometry. Later on, there were alternate geometries that put in place a different geometrical assumption. Specifically, it put in a different interpretation of what parallel is. Euclidean geometry said two parallel lines never intersect. Under these alternate geometries, we can get a consistent geometric system under which, depending on how we reinterpret the parallel postulate, the internal angles sum to either more than or less than 180 degrees. Okay, that's fine. However, when we get to Einstein, we find out that as a matter of fact, our actual world is not Euclidean, which means in our actual world, the internal angles of a triangle do not add up to 180 degrees. And yet, likely all of you have learned that the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. They don't. They add up to slightly more, slightly less. However, because for the measurements we want to take in our day-to-day life, Euclidean geometry predicts well enough, given limiting assumptions, boundary conditions, if we're only concerned with the kinds of things that we measure in day-to-day life, even a triangle on the table, or triangulate the distance between two cities and a third city, or so on. These are relatively small sizes. The internal angles will sum to something that is negligibly different than 180 degrees. If, however, we want to triangulate the location of a distant galaxy, the sizes are vast, and we'll get a non-negligible variation from 180 degrees. And so what we do by our limiting assumptions, our boundary conditions, we explain the situations in which the new theory can be applied just as the old theory could. And so the falsity of the old theory does not entail the falsity of the new theory, because those cases in which the old theory would be obviously false, we've said, well, the new theory doesn't apply as a capture of the old theory there because it's outside of these limiting assumptions and boundary conditions. Okay, but additional problems, some theories we want to reduce are just vastly, radically false. What do we do in that case? We can't say, we say we're getting rid of the old theory, replacing it with a new theory. The old theory reduces to the new theory. There's progress from an old theory to a new theory. It seems like they're concerned with some of the same things, but the old theory was vastly false. So what can we do in that case? Well, in that case, we have an image. All right? An image, a proper set of the descriptions of the new theory here, and those descriptions in terms of the new theory capture in some way the things described by the old theory. So the new theory says something like, if x is A, then x is B, where the old theory said, if x is J, then x is K. As a matter of fact, the old theory was vastly wrong. So what are we doing here? What we're doing is getting an image of the new theory, and the terms in this image are isomorphic to, there's a one-to-one correspondence. Everything listed in this old theory could be listed in this, and what we're saying is that A is an analog to J, even though there was no such thing as J. So we might say something like, well, at one point they were thought to be witches. We found out that there is no such thing as witches. Rather, cases in which someone said that's a witch were something like, well, there was epilepsy. Maybe the person claimed the witch was an epileptic. That might capture it. So before, when we said that is the witch, well, now we say that person has epilepsy. Or maybe instances in which people thought they saw witches were instances of ergotism, a mass hallucination based on a fungus. Okay, so previously when we had a group of people say there's a witch, there's no such thing as a witch. Radically false. Nonetheless, we can make an analogy from there being a witch to there being a case of mass hallucination by ergotism. We can make an analogy from that person's a witch to that person has epilepsy. We can't say that having epilepsy equals being a witch because witches don't exist, so then epilepsy wouldn't exist. Rather, epilepsy is an analog. A in this case refers to the things that we previously thought J referred to. J didn't refer to anything because it was false. But it picked something out of the world. Just as a matter of fact, it wasn't a useful way, an accurate way of describing the world, of dividing up the world. A divides it up in the way that we thought J did. Okay, and so now, with this laid out, so this is what it would be to reduce. So we have a theory of mind, including sort of qualitative experiences. Maybe we can reduce them directly to the new theory and say, well, when we say we're seeing red or when we're in pain, we just mean there's C fibers firing. Maybe seeing red is vastly realized or something. We need to take this indirect route of putting in place an image instead. It's a complicated scientific maneuver that's discussed in terms of scientific progress of one theory to another. We're taking rigorous science and applying it to understanding what reductionism would be. And so it's no longer sort of an a priori metaphysical consideration of whether, well, the mental can be reduced to the physical. We're not dealing with intuitions like Chalmers was. We're dealing with science. Now we have a rigorous way. We could spell out, at least ideally, all of the concepts, all of the laws of psychology, and then see if we can capture them directly by the concepts, the properties, the laws of neurophysics, or whether we can do that under certain conditions, whether we need to put in place an image because the way the world was divided up by psychology was not accurate. Nonetheless, we could see that way of dividing up as an analog to certain parts of the new theory. Maybe as a matter of fact, if we did give 6 n-dimensional phase-space descriptions of all the psychological entities or all the biological entities, we find out really, physics might divide the world up differently than biology does. And so it would be very strange at the physical level to put in things that are highly heterogeneous, highly different, and group them as a kind. Nonetheless, we could put an image in place and say that, well, this strange heterogeneous kind is an analog to the other kind, and that other kind was useful for certain things. And so even though looking purely at the physical level, we may never be motivated to group in that way based on similarity, nonetheless, we can extract that heterogeneous group of things and see that group of things A as an analog to the group of things J, be they dogs, be they the mental experience of pain. After laying this out, Churchland says on page 566 in italics, it is smooth intertheoretic reductions that motivate and sustain statements of cross-theoretic identity, not the other way around. This is important because this is completely different than everything we've seen so far. Everything that we've seen so far says, well, look, if the mind is identical to a part of the body, if a mental experience is identical to a physical experience, then we can reduce them. Churchland is saying, no. If we can reduce a higher level theory to a lower level theory, if we can reduce a higher level property to a lower level property, then we're warranted in saying that they're identical. Not the other way around. Vastly different move here. This puts science in the lead, rather than looking at an intuition and then forcing science to do some work. Say, well, as a matter of intuition, we said that this mental experience was the same as this physical experience, so give us a reduction. No, we do the reduction, and then, if we can, we have identity. If not, we don't. If we thought there was identity, we're wrong. We're wrong on scientific grounds. If we didn't think there's identity, but we did do a reduction, then there is identity. There's what kind of identity? Cross-theoretical identity. One description in one theory is identical, an analog to a description in another theory. And then other terms that are connected to all of this reduction talk, well, if there's an emergent property, that's something that comes up and is beyond the lower level property, then that's supposed to be a counterexample. It's supposed to be a block to the ability to reduce. If qualia are emergent, say because the byproduct case, if our brain just became so complicated in order to deal with survival issues at the physical level that as an emergent thing, we had a byproduct that was qualitative experience, then we can't capture it based on things concerned with survival value based on the physical things. But because we put in place this ordering of things, if we can do a reduction, that warrants identity. Not if we have identity, then it warrants reduction. That's important because if we find an instance of emergence, we don't then say, well, we can't reduce the higher level thing. What we say is that, well, that shows that we have not yet developed our new theory to have sufficient power to capture this emergent property. That's what it says. If we say that this property is emergent, what we mean by saying it's emergent is saying that we do not yet know how to reduce it. We need to increase the power of our new theory. If we do that, increase power, increase power, increase power, we still can't capture it, then maybe we want to say there's a real problem here. But we don't say the new theory doesn't capture it, so there's a problem with reduction. No, there's a current problem with reduction. Not reductionism is false, but rather our theory needs to be made more powerful. And oftentimes, so we made the claim of entailment here, but sometimes we've seen reductionism connected to deduction, to deduce. If I knew all of the laws of the new theory, I could deduce from that the laws of the old theory. But deduction has to do with formal logic, things that can be expressed this way. But if I say, well, so famous example from Hume, the is-ought problem, which is not the same as the naturalism problem. If I say that, Joe murdered Sally, and then from that I say, it is wrong what Joe did. Hume says we can't get any ought claim, a claim that something is wrong or right, from purely descriptive facts. We have to put in place something that is descriptive. Murder is wrong. Before we put in this premise, that argument is invalid. It's invalid because we have a word here that did not occur in this premise. But the way deduction works is we just put in place variables, because all we're concerned is the form of arguments. So Joe murdered Sally, and then here we say the X that Joe did is wrong, WXJ, MJS, these do not connect to one another. I cannot have a term in the conclusion that did not exist in the premise. But if the idea is that I can deduce an old theory from a new theory, the laws of an old theory from the laws of a new theory, well, that's just wrong because we're not dealing with that sort of formal logical relationship here because the terms of the old theory do not occur in the terms of the new theory. It's the whole point of the thing. And then we have a positive conclusion to take from all of this. Churchland says, well, look, we could get lots of power. Imagine a musician. Musicians at birth cannot divide the world up in the way that they can once they're experts. Right? We hear a symphony and it's just sort of a chaos of sounds and we cannot hear the different chords and we cannot divide the different chords into different notes. But once you become an expert, you can. What you've done is learn to reduce the qualitative experience to music theory. And then you can experience the qualitative experiences in a richer way than you could previously based on music theory. And we can do this for introspection by way of phenomenology. We get a complicated phenomenological system and then we can divide up our qualitative experiences more narrowly. Benefit, positive conclusion.